Despite the presence of Inuit hunter-gatherers throughout the northern reaches of America, and the frontier pioneer trappers who got to know them, little formal attention had been paid to their remarkable ability to survive in the harsh Arctic conditions, most obviously witnessed in the disastrous Franklin expedition of 1845, in which 129 officers and men perished due to starvation, food poisoning, and frostbite. Sir John Franklin, a decorated Royal Navy officer, had already led 2 previous Arctic expeditions to chart the northern regions of Hudson Bay in Canada. His first, the Coppermine River expedition in 1819, was plagued by vague orders, poor organisation, unreliable supplies, and a dependence on guides with whom there was no solid relationship they could depend on. Additionally, the members of the expedition were completely unschooled in Arctic travel and survival, such that the project ended in complete disaster, with over half of the party perishing and the remainder barely rescued in time by Yellowknife indigenous tribesmen. Despite his brush with disaster and criticism from some quarters, Franklin's harrowing account of the ordeal became a bestseller, and any suggestion of incompetence was brushed off as bad luck. Indeed, Franklin himself appeared to have learned little from his experience, apart from the conviction that it would have fared better if more money, men and supplies had been thrown at it, as opposed to cultivating a relationship with the natives and adopting their survival techniques. He firmly believed that such expeditions should be the domain of well-provisioned and disciplined Navy men who would operate as cogs in a juggernaut machine that would overcome all obstacles through sheer determination and improvisation. This attitude would come to define the British approach to exploration in general, and polar exploration in particular. The British government, desperate to chart a navigable passage through the Arctic waterways between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, once again appointed him to lead an expedition into Canada, and this time they lavished the venture with customized boats, plenty of supplies, and a free hand to do as he wished. Though ultimately unsuccessful in opening up a northwest passage, it nevertheless resulted in the charting of hundreds of miles of the Mackenzie River and added volumes of scientific information on magnetic activity, geology, and botany towards the annals of the several gentlemen's science clubs that were becoming increasingly fashionable at the time, not to mention cashed up. This public thirst for scientific inquiry expanded the scope of what had till then ostensibly been trade-motivated expeditions. Pressure and financial support from the Royal Society, the Royal Geographic Society, etc., quickly turned these voyages into scientific ventures that shifted the focus onto studying the North Pole, both magnetic and geographic, a change of purpose that was beginning to make the Royal Navy increasingly uncomfortable. You see, in the post-Napoleonic Pax Britannica, there was a distinct lack of action for young officers in which they could test their mettle, as it were. Polar exploration was viewed by some in the Admiralty as an excellent way to develop the next generation of seamen in the absence of conflict. Others didn't see it quite that way, and as the focus expanded beyond merely sailing and into Arctic trekking, there was substantial debate as to how much the Navy ought to participate in supplying both men and material. But it wasn't just gentlemen and admirals getting in on the act. Wealthy merchants, such as booze magnate Felix Booth, pumped substantial personal fortunes into the fit-out and provision of expeditions to the North Pole. The aforementioned Franklin would go on to continue with his own distinguished naval career, including a stint as governor in the colony of Van Diemen's Land, or modern Tasmania. But he would eventually be recalled and offered the lead in yet another expedition to seek the Northwest Passage, despite his now being almost 60 years old and quite unfit for the grueling task of Arctic travel. The reason for his obviously inappropriate commission was that foreigners were now engaging in significant polar exploration, and the politicians back home in London were anxious that those last few 100 square kilometres of uncharted waterways and the honour of being the first through the fabled passage should naturally belong to the British, who had poured both blood and treasure into slogging their way across most of it already. So it was that the ageing Franklin, starved of adventure in Tasmania, stepped up, and despite the extraordinary resources placed at his disposal, he nevertheless found his ships, the Erebus and Terror, the very ships used by James Ross in his own extraordinary journey to Antarctica, became completely icebound and immobilized for years on end. The crew eventually abandoned them, hoping to march to safety across the barren snowfields, but, being sailors, they were completely untrained and unprepared for terrestrial, let alone Arctic trekking. The tragic series of events that subsequently unfolded have been immortalized in both song and canvas, yet the real tragedy was that these desperate men had encountered Inuit hunters on a number of occasions, seemingly without any ability, or, as has been suggested, desire to negotiate their guidance back to civilization.